The lake had always been more than just water and trees to me. It was the one place where the chaos of the world fell silent. Our family cabin, built decades ago by my grandfather, stood like a sentinel at the water's edge. It wasn't a mansion, not even close. It was a modest two-story structure with hand-cut logs, wide windows overlooking the water, and a creaking dock that stretched just far enough to let us dive into the clear, cool depths. Every board and nail carried the weight of memory. Summer nights spent roasting marshmallows, winter mornings wrapped in blankets by the fire, and endless evenings where my cousins and I laughed until our voices cracked. To outsiders, it might have looked like nothing more than an old lake house. But to us, it was irreplaceable. It was where generations had come together, where stories were told, and where my grandfather's spirit still seemed to linger. For me, it wasn't just property, it was a piece of my identity. But no matter how beautiful or sacred a place may be, when it sits within the boundaries of a homeowners association, peace is never guaranteed. The HOA for our lake community had started innocently enough when the neighborhood was first formed, promising to maintain standards and protect property values. Back then, people welcomed the idea. Who wouldn't want a group ensuring the roads stayed paved, the lawns stayed neat, and the shoreline remained pristine? Yet over the years, those promises soured. The leadership changed, and what had once been a helpful organization turned into something closer to a petty dictatorship. The board members, self-appointed guardians of order, began issuing fines for the smallest details. A trash can left out for too long, a boat docked at the wrong angle, a fence painted a shade they didn't approve of. Residents whispered about corruption, about funds being misused, about the HOA targeting those who dared to push back. Many neighbors just paid their fines quietly, unwilling to risk retaliation. I thought I could avoid trouble by staying low. After all, the cabin wasn't my full-time residence. I only came up on weekends or holidays, and I made sure the property was always well kept. I paid my annual dues faithfully, on time, every time. There was no reason for the HOA to even notice me, but one spring morning I opened the mailbox at my primary home in the city and found a red envelope stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside, the letter accused me of owing thousands of dollars in unpaid fees. It wasn't a friendly reminder or a simple mistake. It was an outright demand, threatening further action if I didn't pay immediately. At first, I thought it was some clerical error. I went through my bank records, pulling receipts from the past several years. Every single payment was there, marked and cleared. I wrote a careful response, attaching copies of my records, and mailed it back with confidence that the issue would be resolved. Weeks passed, and then another letter came. This one was even more aggressive. Final notice before legal action. The fees had mysteriously increased with late penalties tacked on. The tone wasn't just bureaucratic, it was hostile, almost gleeful. I should have known then that something darker was at play. But I trusted logic. I believed facts would clear everything up. I sent another response, even firmer this time, demanding correction. I heard nothing back. Silence. Then, months later, the silence broke in the most brutal way possible. It was a Friday evening when I drove up to the cabin, planning to spend the weekend by the lake. The drive was familiar, winding through pine-lined roads until the trees opened and the water came into view. But as I approached the bend that led to our family's property, my stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The cabin was gone, not damaged, not vandalized, completely gone. Where the cabin once stood proud against the shoreline, there was now only rubble, broken beams, shattered glass, piles of splintered wood. The chimney lay toppled on its side, half buried in dirt. Even the dock had been ripped apart, pieces of it drifting in the shallow waves. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands stayed frozen on the steering wheel, my eyes locked on the wreckage. When I finally stepped out of the car, the silence of the scene pressed down on me. I could almost hear the echoes of the past. The laughter, the stories, the sound of my grandfather's hammer on wood, all drowned under the cruel reality of destruction. Pinned to a post at the edge of the property was a laminated notice. Bold. Black letters screamed at me. Demolition executed by order of the Homeowners Association. Non-payment of fees. I must have read it a dozen times, hoping it would change. Non-payment of fees. Demolition executed, as if those words could ever justify what I was seeing. Shock gave way to rage. They hadn't contacted me. They hadn't taken me to court. They hadn't even given me the chance to stand in front of a judge and defend myself. They had simply taken matters into their own hands, erasing not just a structure but decades of family history. As I walked among the ruins, each step cracked wood under my feet, each sound another reminder of what was stolen. The spot where the dining table once sat was just dirt and broken glass. The fireplace, where my cousins and I had warmed ourselves after swimming, was reduced to rubble. The loft where I used to fall asleep to the sound of rain on the roof no longer existed. It was more than vandalism. It was an attack. And the HOA thought they could get away with it. They thought they could intimidate me into silence, just as they had with so many others. They believed I was just another powerless homeowner, isolated and unable to fight back. What they didn't know was the truth about my family. I wasn't alone. My siblings, cousins, and uncles weren't ordinary people working ordinary jobs. They were federal agents, men and women who dedicated their lives to upholding the law, fighting corruption, and exposing abuse of power. FBI, Homeland Security, Special Task Forces, you name it. Someone in my family had worn the badge. We didn't brag about it. We didn't use it to scare people. But it was who we were. And now, standing in the ruins of my grandfather's cabin, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The HOA had declared war on the wrong family. I pulled out my phone, my hands still trembling, and began dialing numbers. Not lawyers, not local police, my family. One by one they answered, and one by one. I explained what had happened. Shock turned to fury. Fury turned to resolve. The HOA thought this was over. But in truth, it was only the beginning. When I ended those calls that night, I knew my world had shifted. The rubble at my feet wasn't just the remains of a cabin. It was the spark that ignited a storm. My family, spread across agencies and specialties, had one unspoken rule. We never let injustice slide. Not when it was this blatant, not when it struck so close to home. The first to arrive was my older brother, Daniel. He drove through the night, pulling up just as the morning mist rolled across the lake. Daniel wasn't the kind of man you'd want to face if you'd done something wrong. Years in the FBI's white-collar crime division had trained him to spot corruption from a mile away. He stepped out of his SUV, surveying the wreckage with the practiced eye of someone cataloging evidence. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "This wasn't incompetence," he finally said. "This was deliberate. They wanted to make an example out of you." By midday, the others began to arrive. My cousin Sarah, a Homeland Security investigator, parked her government-issued vehicle near the remains of the dock. She carried a notebook and a camera, documenting every splinter, every scrap of paper, every nail left behind. She didn't just see wreckage, she saw a crime scene. Behind her came Marcus, another cousin whose career in federal property law made him an expert in land disputes. He was already flipping through the laminated demolition notice, muttering legal codes under his breath. Then came the uncles, veterans of different branches, men who'd spent their lives in service and had little patience for bullies. One after another, they walked the site, shaking their heads, anger simmering beneath the surface. My family didn't need to hold a formal meeting. We had done this kind of thing before. though never for something so personal. With every step, with every observation, a plan was already forming. By evening, the wreckage no longer felt like a place of defeat. It felt like a staging ground. We set up a temporary base at my cousin Sarah's camper, parked on the lot's edge. Maps of the community spread across the table, alongside stacks of HOA documents pulled from public records. Marcus began dissecting the bylaws line by line, exposing contradictions and illegal clauses. Sarah logged every photo she had taken into a federal database, creating a timeline of destruction. Daniel began cross-referencing the HOA board members' financial backgrounds, muttering each time he found a red flag. And me? I sat in silence for long stretches, staring at the ruined chimney, remembering my grandfather's words. This cabin will outlive me. It'll be here for you, and your children after you. Except it wasn't anymore. It had been stolen. But as the fireflies blinked in the darkness and the hum of my family's work filled the air, I realized something. Maybe the cabin was gone, but the legacy wasn't. The legacy lived in us, and now it burned hotter than ever. The next morning, the first real crack in the HOA's armor appeared. Sarah had pulled security footage from a lakeside gas station showing 3 unmarked trucks driving toward the community days before the demolition. Flatbeds, loaded with heavy equipment. She traced the plates. They were rented by a company owned by none other than the HOA president's brother-in-law. Not only had the HOA bypassed legal protocol, but they'd used family connections to carry out the demolition. Conflict of interest, abuse of power, conspiracy, it was all right there. Meanwhile, Daniel uncovered something even more damning. The HOA's financial filings, already murky, showed large unexplained transfers in and out of their accounts. Money was being funneled to shell companies, some of which tied back to the same names appearing in Marcus's property records. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This HOA had been running a racket, extorting residents and pocketing the profits under the guise of fees. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. My case was only one of many. My neighbors had been victims too. Fined unfairly, threatened, even forced to sell under pressure. My demolition wasn't an accident. It was part of a larger pattern of control, but the HOA board didn't know we had started piecing their empire apart. To them, I was just another homeowner licking his wounds. So when I walked into their monthly meeting the following week, their faces registered only mild surprise. The meeting was held in the community hall, a sterile room with folding chairs and a long table where the board sat, puffed up with authority. The president, a man named Caldwell with a smug grin permanently glued to his face, greeted me with feigned politeness. "Here to discuss your outstanding balance?" he asked, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The audience chuckled nervously. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, I sat quietly at the back, listening, observing, while my family worked in the shadows. Daniel was all ready, running surveillance on Caldwell's phone records. Sarah was cross-checking the demolition permits, or rather, the absence of them. Marcus had filed requests with the county registrar, pulling ownership histories that would soon unravel fraudulent transfers. The HOA thought they had silenced me. They thought their intimidation worked, but all I felt sitting there was a strange calm, because I knew something they didn't. Their empire of lies was already crumbling, and it was my family who was dismantling it piece by piece. That night, back at the lake, we gathered again. This time, the mood wasn't heavy. It was electric. Evidence piled higher by the hour. Sarah connected the rental trucks to other demolitions in neighboring communities. Daniel traced shell company payments back to offshore accounts. Marcus identified a string of illegal property seizures, each tied to the same names. The HOA had been operating like a criminal syndicate, and we now held the blueprint of their operation in our hands. As the fire crackled in the pit where the cabin once stood, Daniel leaned forward and said the words that sealed our course. They think this is about fees. They think this is about one cabin. But what they don't know is we're building a federal case. And by the time we're finished, this entire HOA will come crashing down. I looked out over the lake, the moon casting a silver path across the water, and felt the anger inside me sharpen into resolve. The fight wasn't just for me anymore. It was for every family they had bullied, every neighbor they had robbed, and every memory they had tried to erase. The HOA had made their move. Now it was our turn. The days following that meeting were a strange mix of calm before the storm and relentless preparation. On the surface, the HOA carried on as if nothing had happened. Caldwell and his board strutted through the neighborhood, issuing petty warnings, sending letters, and pretending their authority was untouchable. But underneath that thin layer of control, cracks were already forming, cracks that my family was prying open wider with every hour. The first step in any fight like this wasn't brute force. It was information. My family knew that better than anyone. Daniel always said, "You don't knock down the walls until you've mapped every weak spot." So that's what we did. Every board member was researched, every connection traced, every unexplained dollar accounted for. Sarah worked late nights on her laptop, eyes glowing from the screen as she pieced together timelines of suspicious demolitions across 3 counties. Dozens of homes had been destroyed under flimsy pretenses, always with the same construction company involved, the one tied to Caldwell's brother-in-law. Marcus pulled property records and found a chilling pattern. After each demolition, the AD, land was mysteriously transferred into holding companies, then resold at inflated prices. It wasn't negligence, it was a business model. Meanwhile, Daniel obtained phone logs through his channels, not by hacking, but by leveraging contacts who owed him favors. Those logs revealed constant communication between Caldwell and 2 county officials, the same officials responsible for approving permits, except, as Marcus confirmed, no permits had ever officially been filed for my cabin's demolition, which meant those officials weren't approving anything. They were covering it up. Piece by piece, the image of the HOA shifted from petty tyrants to an organized ring of fraudsters. They weren't just abusing their authority. They were laundering money, committing fraud, and exploiting their own community for profit. But we couldn't just sit back and collect evidence forever. To break a system like this, you had to make it stumble. You had to make it panic. And so the first strike was planned. It began quietly, on a Tuesday morning, when Sarah walked into the county clerk's office, dressed not as herself, but as a civilian homeowner with questions. She asked about demolition permits for lakeside properties. The clerk, unaware of who she really was, shuffled through records and admitted something startling. No such permits existed for any of the demolitions Sarah listed. Not mine, not the neighbors, none of them. Sarah thanked the clerk, left politely, and immediately sent the recording to Daniel. 1 weak link exposed. The second strike came the very next day. Marcus filed an anonymous complaint with the state's property law division, attaching documents proving fraudulent transfers of land titles. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was hard evidence, dressed up in legal language, sharp enough to cut through even the thickest bureaucratic red tape. By the third strike, the HOA felt the tremors. Daniel arranged for a quiet leak to a local journalist he trusted. Nothing too bold, just enough to plant seeds. The article appeared online under the headline, "Questions Raised About HOA Demolitions at Lakeside Community." It was short, speculative, almost cautious, but it carried just enough bite to get residents talking. And once people start talking, fear begins to shift sides. The ripple effect was immediate. Neighbors began whispering in grocery stores, asking each other if they'd read the article. Those who had once paid their fines in silence now started, digging up their own documents, checking receipts, comparing notes. For the first time in years, Caldwell's board wasn't the only one holding power. Doubt had entered the community, and doubt is contagious. Of course, Caldwell noticed. By Friday, I received a letter, hand-delivered this time, with words written. In bold, all-caps font, cease all defamation or face legal consequences. I laughed when I read it, not because it wasn't threatening, it was, but because it confirmed exactly what we wanted. They were rattled. Caldwell and his cronies weren't used to being challenged. They weren't used to anyone pulling back the curtain on their operations. And now, for the first time, they were forced to react. That night, my family gathered. At the fire pit once again, though the cabin itself no longer stood. The air was heavy with smoke and determination. "They're feeling it," Daniel said, tapping his laptop where Caldwell's name appeared in a log of flagged financial activities. "The transfers have slowed. They're moving money around faster, trying to cover their tracks. That means they know someone's watching." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. "The more they scramble, the more mistakes they'll make. But we need residents on our side. If this stays just our fight, they'll paint us as troublemakers. We need witnesses, victims, people willing to speak out." She was right. Evidence mattered, but momentum mattered more. And momentum came from people. So the next phase of our plan wasn't about documents or databases. It was about knocking on doors. One by one, house by house, we spoke to neighbors. Some were reluctant, afraid of retaliation. But others, especially those who had lost money or property, were eager to finally share their stories. An elderly couple whose boat dock had been torn out for violating shoreline regulations. A single mother fined thousands for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue. A widower who claimed he'd been forced to sell after constant harassment. Every story added another layer to the case, another nail in the coffin of the HOA's illusion of authority. By the end of the week, we had dozens of sworn statements, stacks of photographs, and hours of recorded testimony. What had started as a personal vendetta was evolving into something much bigger, a full-scale operation to expose corruption at the highest levels of the HOA and beyond. But Caldwell wasn't going down without a fight. On Saturday morning, as the sun broke over the lake, a black SUV rolled slowly past the property where we had set up camp. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. The tinted windows and deliberate crawl of its tires said enough. It was a warning, a message that they were watching us as closely as we were watching them. I stood at the edge of the ruined dock, watching. The SUV disappear around the bend, and I knew the game had officially changed. The HOA wasn't just rattled anymore. They were preparing to strike back, and when they did, we would be ready. The SUV wasn't just a car. It was a message. The kind of message bullies send when they've run out of patience with subtle threats. I knew it. My family knew it. And the HOA, for all their arrogance, had finally revealed their hand. They weren't going to stay in the shadows anymore. They were coming after us. The retaliation started quietly, almost laughably at first. A neighbor we'd interviewed about her fines found a notice on her door the next morning. Violation, unauthorized gathering. Her only crime? Talking to us on her porch. Another neighbor received a letter threatening foreclosure over unapproved landscaping. It was absurd, but effective. The board was trying to reassert dominance to scare people back into silence. But then it got personal. One night, while Daniel and I were sorting through a stack of financial ledgers, headlights flashed across the ruined lot. We rushed outside to find Caldwell himself standing on the road, arms crossed, flanked by two board members. He didn't step onto the property. He didn't dare, but he didn't need to. His words carried across the dark, sharp, and deliberate. "You're making a mistake," he called. "This community has rules, rules you broke. Walk away now, and maybe we can forget about all this." I stared at him, rage boiling in my chest. "You demolished my family's cabin." He smirked as if I'd just reminded him of some minor inconvenience. "Consequences of non-payment. Don't like it? Take it up with the courts. Oh, wait. You can't. You signed away that right when you joined this community." Before I could reply, Daniel stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Caldwell didn't answer. He just smiled that smug, infuriating smile and climbed back into his SUV. The engine roared and the vehicle disappeared into the night, leaving behind only dust and silence. The moment he was gone, Daniel turned to me. "He's bluffing. He doesn't think we can touch him, which means he's desperate, but desperation can be dangerous." The very next day, Sarah's government laptop was hacked. It wasn't subtle. Whoever did it wasn't skilled enough to cover their tracks. But the attempt was clear. Someone wanted to know what we had. Someone wanted to see how much evidence we'd gathered. Thankfully, Sarah's training had her running layers of security, and the intrusion failed. But the fact they even tried sent a chill down all of us. 2 days later, Marcus discovered that my name had been flagged in county records as a delinquent taxpayer. Completely false, of course, but enough to trigger an investigation from the local revenue office. Caldwell's fingerprints were all over it. He was using his allies in local government to smear me, to slow us down with bureaucratic harassment. That night, as we sat by the fire pit, the frustration was palpable. We had the evidence. We had the witnesses. But the HOA was using fear and connections to hold the line. And with every delay, residents grew more anxious, unsure whether standing with us was worth the risk. It was Sarah who broke the silence. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "If they're going to play dirty, then it's time we remind them who we are. No more waiting, no more quiet moves. We go public." Daniel nodded slowly, his jaw set. "Agreed. A controlled leak. Enough to expose them, but strategic enough that they can't wriggle out with excuses." Within days, the plan was set. Using Sarah's recordings, Marcus's documents, and Daniel's financial analysis, we compiled a comprehensive dossier. It detailed everything: the illegal demolitions, the fraudulent property transfers, the money laundering, the intimidation tactics. It was damning, airtight, and ready for the world to see. The first release went to the journalist Daniel had trusted earlier. This time, it wasn't a cautious article. It was a full exposé published under the headline, "HOA Corruption Ring Accused of Fraud, Illegal Demolitions, and Intimidation Tactics." The story exploded. Local news picked it up, then regional outlets. Within 48 hours, it was trending statewide. Residents who had been too afraid to speak suddenly found their voices. Social media lit up with stories, photos, and videos of abuses that mirrored mine. The HOA board, once feared, was now infamous. Caldwell's response was as predictable as it was pathetic. He called an emergency town hall, trying to spin the narrative. The flyer he sent out painted himself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled residents. Of course, we went. The hall was packed, more people than I'd ever seen attend an HOA meeting before. Caldwell stood at the front, his suit immaculate, his expression dripping with false sincerity. He launched into his speech, claiming all actions were within legal bounds, and that rumors of corruption were baseless attacks. But this time, the room wasn't silent. People shouted questions. They demanded answers. Some even waved. Copies of the article in the air, pointing at the damning evidence. Then Sarah stood, calm, professional, unflinching. She introduced herself not just as a resident, but as a federal investigator. The room went silent. Caldwell froze. And in that silence, Sarah laid out the facts. Dates, names, records, all of it, in front of everyone. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell tried to cut her off, but his voice faltered under the weight of the truth. By the time she sat down, the room wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the residents, to the people he had wronged. That night, as Caldwell slunk away with his cronies, I realized the balance had shifted. For years, he had ruled through fear and silence. But now, the fear was his. The silence was broken. Still, victory wasn't complete. Caldwell wasn't finished. A man like him, cornered, was at his most dangerous. And though we had pulled the curtain back, we all knew the fight was far from over. Because corrupt men don't go down easy. They drag everyone they can with them. And Caldwell had just begun to show how far he was willing to go. The town hall was a turning point, but it didn't end the fight. It only cornered Caldwell. And a cornered man, especially one who has built his empire on fear and fraud, doesn't surrender. He lashes out. The morning after the meeting, 3 residents who had spoken up publicly against the HOA found their driveways blocked by construction cones and work orders nailed to their fences. None of them had requested repairs. None of them knew who ordered the work. But the message was clear. We know where you live, and we can make your life impossible. By noon, one of the neighbors called me in tears. Her water had been mysteriously shut off. Another found his electricity temporarily disconnected for non-payment, though his bills were current. Caldwell wasn't fighting us in the open anymore. He was punishing the community for daring to defy him, hoping fear would snap them back into submission. But fear had shifted. The people he targeted didn't shrink away. They came to us. And each new act of intimidation only deepened the residents' resolve. By the end of that week, our evidence pile had doubled, not just with paperwork, but with testimonies, recordings of threats, copies of fines, photos of harassment. Caldwell's campaign of fear had backfired spectacularly. Still, we knew he wasn't finished. On Friday night, just as we sat down to review Sarah's newest findings, headlights swept across the ruins of my cabin again. But this time, it wasn't a single SUV. It was 3. Engines rumbled as they stopped at the edge of the lot. Doors opened and 6 men stepped out. Caldwell's enforcers, the same board members who had flanked him at the earlier confrontation. They weren't dressed like neighbors. They wore matching jackets, their stance too rigid, their movements too practiced. This wasn't a casual visit. It was intimidation, pure and simple. One of them shouted across the lot, "You need to leave, tonight. This property isn't yours anymore. The HOA has authority here." Daniel rose slowly from his chair, his silhouette backlit by the fire. His voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. "This property belongs to my family, and unless you have a federal warrant, you're trespassing." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't move. Caldwell hadn't come himself. He'd sent muscle, hoping to scare us into retreat. Instead, Sarah stood, holding up her phone. "You're on camera. Every word, every face. If you don't leave now, this recording goes straight to the U.S. Attorney's office." That broke them. One by one, the men backed toward their SUVs. Their bravado faded as the reality of who they were dealing with sank in. Engines roared, gravel scattered, and within minutes they were gone. But the encounter left a chill in the air. "They're escalating," Daniel muttered, pacing by the fire. "If Caldwell is willing to send men here, it won't stop at intimidation. He's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes, big ones." He was right. The next mistake came just 2 days later, when Caldwell filed a lawsuit, not against me, but against the entire neighborhood. In a move that stunned even Marcus, he accused dozens of residents of conspiracy to defame the HOA and demanded millions in damages. It was absurd, baseless, and destined to fail. But it served its purpose, to scare the residents into silence again. What Caldwell didn't realize was that he had just crossed the line from corruption into open fraud, documented for the courts to see. And this time, the fight wasn't just personal or local, it was federal. Daniel made the call first, not to a journalist, not to county officials, but directly to his old contact in the Department of Justice. Within hours, wheels were in motion. The DOJ wanted everything: Sarah's recordings, Marcus's documents, the financial logs, the testimonies. Every shred of evidence we had was uploaded, encrypted, and sent through official channels. For the first time, the weight of the federal government pressed against Caldwell's tiny kingdom of intimidation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood transformed. What had once been a fearful, fractured community was now united. People dropped by our camp daily with boxes of documents, copies of fines, even old emails from the board. Some brought coffee, others brought food. Many simply came to say thank you. The HOA's power was unraveling, not because of us alone, but because the people had decided they'd had enough. Caldwell's empire, built on silence, was crumbling under the weight of voices that refused to be quiet any longer. Still, Caldwell wasn't done. Late one night, while the moon hung low, over the lake, Sarah's camper shook violently. We burst outside to find the tires slashed, the windows cracked. Spray painted across the side in jagged red letters were the words, "Get out!" For a moment, the air was thick with fury. Daniel's fists clenched. Marcus cursed under his breath. But Sarah only took out her phone, calmly photographing every detail. "This isn't vandalism," she said. "This is evidence." The next morning, those photos were in the hands of the DOJ. The timeline of Caldwell's downfall wasn't measured in weeks or months anymore. It was days, maybe hours. By then, the community hall had become a fortress of paranoia. Caldwell held meetings behind closed doors, guarded by the same men who had shown up at my property. His tone grew angrier, his letters more desperate. He accused residents of betrayal, claimed conspiracies, even hinted that outside agitators were plotting against the community. But the truth was obvious. He wasn't protecting the community. He was protecting himself. And soon, even his allies began to see it. By midweek, one board member broke ranks. She knocked on my door late at night, trembling as she handed me a folder. Inside were internal emails, Caldwell ordering demolitions without permits, arranging kickbacks from construction companies, and openly mocking the residents he was supposed to serve. "This has gone too far," she whispered. "I can't do this anymore." Her defection was the final crack. With her testimony and documents, the case against Caldwell became unshakable. The DOJ didn't just have evidence of corruption, they had insider proof of conspiracy. The storm that Caldwell had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated was finally here. And when it broke, it would wash away everything he had built. The morning of the raid was deceptively calm. The lake shimmered under the rising sun, the air cool and still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. But beneath that calm, a storm had gathered. One Caldwell could no longer outrun. At dawn, unmarked federal SUVs rolled quietly into the community. My family knew the drill. We had coordinated the handoff of evidence, we had signed the affidavits, and now it was out of our hands. The Department of Justice had taken over. From the porch of a supportive neighbor's home, I watched as agents in windbreakers fanned out across the streets. They weren't subtle anymore. Radios crackled, boots hit pavement, and official warrants were posted on doors. The residents emerged from their homes stunned, whispering in disbelief as the HOA's fortress began to crumble in real time. The first arrest was one of Caldwell's enforcers, the same man who had shouted at us by my ruined cabin. He resisted, swore, even tried to shove an agent. But within seconds, his hands were cuffed behind his back, his bravado silenced by the weight of federal authority. More followed. 2 county officials were pulled from their offices, escorted, in suits and handcuffs. The brother-in-law construction owner was dragged from a job site, his bulldozer still running as agents read him his rights. Each arrest sent ripples through the neighborhood, each name confirming what we had suspected all along. This wasn't just corruption, It was organized crime, hiding behind the mask of an HOA. But the final act belonged to Caldwell. He was at the community hall, the self-proclaimed throne of his power, when they came for him. I wasn't inside, but I saw it from across the street. Caldwell stood at the front shouting at residents, insisting he was the victim of a conspiracy. His voice cracked, his face red, sweat dripping down his temples. And then, in the middle of his tirade, the doors burst open. Federal agents marched in, calm and precise. One of them read the warrant aloud. Caldwell laughed, high-pitched, desperate. He denied everything, pointed fingers, even tried to rally the residents to his side. But no one moved. No one defended him, because the truth was undeniable. As agents closed in, Caldwell's laughter collapsed into rage. He slammed his fists against the table, spit flying as he screamed threats. But rage doesn't stop handcuffs. Within minutes, the man who had ruled with arrogance and intimidation was being escorted out the doors, wrists bound, his shouts drowned out by the sound of cameras clicking. The residents stood in silence, watching the fall of their so-called leader. Some cried, not out of sadness, but relief. Others simply shook their heads as if waking from a nightmare they hadn't realized they were trapped in. And just like that, the HOA's reign ended. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened. More arrests were made, more accounts frozen, more fraud uncovered. Caldwell and his board faced charges ranging from racketeering to mail fraud to destruction of property. The county officials who had looked the other way found themselves under indictment. The construction company folded, its assets seized. For the community, the change was immediate. The HOA, once a weapon of control, was dissolved by court order. A temporary management committee, made up of residents, not bullies, took over, with plans to rebuild trust and transparency. People who had lived in fear for years finally breathed freely again. And as for me, I stood once more at the edge of my family's lot, staring at the foundation where the cabin once stood. The rubble had been cleared, replaced by open earth and the whisper of possibility. My siblings and cousins gathered with me that day. Daniel rested a hand on my shoulder. "We took them down," he said. "Now it's time to rebuild." He was right. The cabin was gone, but the spirit of it wasn't. The lake still shimmered. The dock could be rebuilt. The laughter of future generations could still echo across the water. And maybe, just maybe, the destruction had given us something new. A reminder that family wasn't about buildings or boards or possessions. It was about standing together no matter the cost. As we laid out plans for a new structure, Sarah snapped one last photo of the lot, capturing the cleared earth, the lake behind it, and our family standing strong in the frame. "This time," she said, "it won't just be a cabin. It'll be a symbol. Proof that no matter how much they tried to erase us, we're still here." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I swear I could hear my grandfather's voice again. "This cabin will outlive me. It'll be here for you, and your children after you." He'd been right. Not about the building itself, but about the legacy. Caldwell thought he had destroyed us when he tore down the walls of our cabin, but in the end, he only strengthened us. He revealed the depth of our resolve, the unbreakable bond of family, and the power of truth against corruption. And as the sun dipped low over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I knew one thing for certain. The cabin would rise again, this time stronger, this time untouchable, this time forever.